And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Richard Lang, commercial pilot, former law enforcement officer, and one of the best UFO investigators on planet Earth since the 90s. He wrote guidelines for how first responders should react to UAP incidents, which we're going to learn about and more. Richard, thanks for joining us today and welcome.
Thank you for having me. Good to talk with you.
So, Richard, how did you become interested in UFOs in the first place?
Well, this has been kind of a lifelong interest for me. I'm a commercial pilot, and I went to school for aeronautics. I got a degree in aeronautics, and I was flying up the coast of Florida one night by myself, and it was about 11:30 at night, and essentially there was an encounter between an Eastern Airlines jet, a private jet, and what was described as a huge UFO, something the size of a football stadium that was hovering out over the ocean. And the way I encountered this is typically when you're flying like that, you're talking to the departure controller, which is the place you left, and then you're talking to the air traffic controller on the other radio to the next place you're going. So I'm just listening to that air traffic, and an Eastern Airlines pilot comes on and says, "Hey, we have traffic in our flight path," and what that means is there's another aircraft in their flight path. And the controller comes back and says, negative radar contact. And so the pilot, he identified as an Eastern airline pilot. He comes back again and he's like, we have traffic in our flight path. We both have a visual on it. And the controller comes back and says, negative radar contact. And you could tell everybody's getting tense, you know. And so finally, the pilot comes back the third time and he goes, look, we've got traffic in our flight path. It's huge, unconventional. It's hovering over the ocean and it's rotating slowly with multicolored lights on it. And then another pilot chimes in and he's in a business jet and he goes, we have a visual on the same object. Air traffic controller's like, negative radar contact. And then everything gets quiet because pilots don't like to talk about that stuff on the radio. So I was going up to Jacksonville, which is at that time it was a military and a civilian airport, Jacksonville Naval Station, and I was going to land, get gas, and go back to Daytona. Well, when I got up there, they wouldn't let me land, and they told me they had me flying around a circle, maintain holding for departing military traffic. And so I'm kind of flying there, looking down on the runway, and I see these two fighter jets come screaming off the runway. They go blowing out over the ocean. You can hear them blowing through the sound barrier, full lit up with afterburners, and they're going right out to where those pilots said that thing was. So I guess the lesson I learned was that, first of all, there was something unconventional that was identified by pilots from two jet aircraft from different perspective angles, and that the radar operators refused to acknowledge it, but they sort of confirmed it by dispatching fighter jets out to check it out. So I was a young man at that time, and that sort of like got me started on all this.
I had a guest before that was in the Coast Guard, and his job was standing on top of the ship looking for drug planes sneaking in at nighttime.
Yeah.
And he spotted a UFO, and whenever they would see something, they would call down back into the boat and say, what do you see on radar? And whatever he spotted didn't show up on radar. And I was thinking maybe yours didn't either. And I was curious,
I think
why
it did.
don't they?
Well, I think it did because they dispatched the jets, but a lot of times that stuff does show up on radar. And some of them have, I think it's a stealth capability where they can block some of that radar signal, but it does show up on radar a lot. There's a lot of cases where they say that, you know.
Well, there's a lot going on in current events lately with President Trump, Vice President Vance, Congressman Burkett, and there's been a big upsurge in UFO information and traffic. Can you give us your take on all that?
Yeah, I can tell you how that all evolved. Again, I've been doing this for 30 years. And I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, there's more stuff come out than there has in the last 30. And I think a lot of that has to do with, it goes back to maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Now the Secretary of Defense, Rubio, he was head of the Defense Intelligence Group in Congress. And what had been happening for a long time is that they were getting reports of these UFOs that were violating restricted airspace, hovering over nuclear weapons storage facilities, hovering over nuclear missile silo bases, and sometimes actually shutting them down and stuff like that. And there were all these reports that these guys in Congress and this defense group were getting these reports, and they were wanting to know what's going on. And typically what they do is they'd schedule meetings and interview people from the Pentagon who would basically come down and just lie to them the whole time. So what they did was they got about 50 guys in Congress, and there's a bill that goes through the Congress every year. It's called the National Defense Authorization Act. And essentially what that bill does is allocates all the money to pay all the bills for all the different military operations. Last year, they allocated $866 billion. So 3 years ago, what these guys did, these bills are 1,500 pages, you know. So they put language in this bill that said, if you are working in a special access program, if you're employed where you've had direct hands-on contact with non-human bodies or spacecraft wreckage that's been recovered that's of extraterrestrial origin, and if you sign a national security agreement, you're hereby given immunity from prosecution if you come forward and testify in a congressional hearing. And it specifically says in that agreement that if you sign a national security agreement, if you testify before a congressional committee, you cannot be prosecuted or arrested. And that got signed into law 3 years ago. That's a federal law now. So once that happened, that's when you start to see a lot of these guys that have been in these programs that have been keeping quiet about this all these years. They're coming out and telling congressmen what's really going on. The first of which was a guy named David Gresh, and it was a televised hearing that was actually nationally televised, and he was on there for a couple hours, and he's like, look, this is the most highly kept secret in the United States government. There's facilities all over the country that are operated by private, like defense contractors, where they've got crash wreckage, alien bodies, he called them non-human biologicals, and they've been doing this research for 50 years. And some of the congressmen are going like, well, where are these places? And he goes, if you go in the SCIF, which is a secret, a classified briefing area, he goes, I'll give you a list of them and tell you where they were. So that's what started it. And so then you've got a bunch of people in Congress like Luna and Tim Burchett that are they're just pushing and pushing and pushing to get more and more of this stuff come out. So that's kind of how it started. And it's kind of like a snowball going down a hill. It just keeps, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's more stuff coming out every day. And now what you're dealing with is, there's things that they're talking about now that even there's not too much in this that comes out that surprises me because I've been heavily involved in this for a long time. But you've got admirals from the United States Navy coming out and telling congressmen that there's places under the ocean that are the size of cities that are occupied by non-humans. And you never heard anything like that 5 years ago. So it's just unbelievable amount of information that's coming out. And it's just putting more and more pressure on, there was an interview that Obama did a few weeks ago, and he basically said, yeah, they're real. And he goes, I haven't seen any. But, and he made a reference to Area 51. And he said, I don't think they're underground there. Well, that's not true. There are underground facilities there. But then he qualified that and he said, if that is true, that means there's this huge secret program to keep this information from the Congress and the President of the United States. So he sort of told you that what was really going on. And then Trump picked up on that, and he's under a lot of pressure to disclose it. And even before the election, his sons were all like, they're really interested in this, and they keep bugging him to tell more about what's going on. So Trump gave an order a few weeks ago to the Department of, not Defense, the Department of War now, to basically tell them to release a bunch of information. And then Luna, she gave them a list of 45 videos that they want, and they're supposed to be releasing those pretty soon. So that's how this is evolving. And I think you're going to see more and more of it as the time goes on.
What do you think about all those scientists that are either missing or dead?
I don't know. I know that a lot of that some of that started happening right after Trump made the order to release the information. And that, from what I understand, those people are in. I'm not an insider. Okay, I just research, investigate, and talk about what we know. But I'm not a guy that's been in there, you know, putting alien bodies in glass tubes. You see what I'm saying? But there are people like that that have been directly exposed to that, involved in it. They're insiders, and you know, if you wanted to hide it, you probably want some of them to not be able to talk about it. There was one of them, I'm trying to remember, he was supposed to go to a congressional hearing a couple weeks ago and then ended up in a mysterious car accident a couple days before, that kind of thing. So there's clearly a lot of pressure both ways on this. And in my books, I've written what I call the history lesson. You know, what makes this a little bit easier to understand is that if you look back at how this all evolved, you can go back. The research I did, the first reference I could find is a letter from General MacArthur back in the World War II era. And he had written a letter to somebody else in the military saying that they had recovered crash wreckage that he clearly identified as extraterrestrial and there were non-human bodies in it. And then when Truman became president, he was the vice president, and then Roosevelt died and he became president. He was confronted with this situation where they had recovered some of these craft. There was the ones at Roswell, Los Alamos. There was a number of craft that had been recovered. And so Truman and his guys are like trying to figure out what to do about this. And I think Truman's position was, look, I don't know who these guys are, where they come from, or what's going on, but their technology is hundreds of years ahead of us. And so from a military standpoint, it would make sense for us to study it and keep it secret. Because remember, he was into technology. He's the one that dropped the atomic bomb. So essentially, that's what they did. They created a group of people. It's called the Majestic 12, and it was comprised of some military people, government people, and I was surprised that half of them were on the Commission of Foreign Relations. That really shocked me, but that is true. And they've had this stronghold on this information. So moving forward, what they would do is when they recovered crash wreckage, they made deals with private companies to develop and do the back engineering and develop the research and all that. And the deals they made with them were like, you can make money on patent rights, you can make all the money you want, as long as you keep the technology for military applications for us. And so that's what happened. And that's where the whole thing, that's where the problem is. Because if you look at these companies, like an example was the first fiber optic tubing came from a saucer crash that was recovered that was given to Bell Laboratories in 1960. And now half the world is wired together with fiber optic tubing, if you're with me. So you can imagine how much money they made on that. And the same thing with the microchip technology that was given to IBM and Texas Instruments and Boeing. And now what you have, if you fast forward 50 years, all these defense contractors, these billion-dollar defense contractors that have been using that technology to develop their research and make tons of money, they have control of all that. And people will say to me, well, why doesn't the government just tell us what they have or show up? The problem is because they don't have it. What they did is all this stuff has been farmed out to these private defense contractors and aerospace contractors. And once they have it, they own it, it's proprietary information. So you can't file a Freedom of Information Act to get or have them, they're not accountable to any kind of congressional oversight or anything. They can do whatever they want. And that's how they've kept this secret so long. But the problem is these corporations are so powerful now. And I think that's what, you could see that evolving when Eisenhower when he was ready to leave office, he was really upset because they basically went renegade on him, and they cut him and Congress out of the loop. And he had been trying to find out, like there's some pretty substantial documentation saying that he had tried to find out what was going on in Area 51, and they told him that he didn't have a high enough security clearance. So Eisenhower basically sent some guys out there and said, if you don't tell me what I want to know, I think it was like, if I don't have what I want to know on my desk by noon Friday, a week from today, I'm going to go out to Colorado, take over the 1st Cavalry. I'm going to come in there and rip that place apart. And I guess they probably believed him, since he was a general that just won World War II, that he probably would have the know how to do that. And so he was briefed, but he was really upset about it because he was starting to realize how far they've developed and how they weren't sharing any of that with the public. And that's why you saw when Eisenhower made his famous speech about beware of the military-industrial complex, that's what he was talking about. That they developed they developed all these aerospace corporations, and they basically became autonomous global corporations, and cut him and Congress out of the loop. And that's been going on until now. Until very recently is what you're seeing is the results of that. And that's the stronghold, or the secrecy that has the clamp, if you will, or have a handle on it. So now, with all this coming forward and all the disclosure now, these corporations are starting to get pretty nervous, because if the truth comes out, the public's going to get briefed on all the stuff they've done, all the trillions of dollars they've made, none of which has ever been accountable to Congress or even for tax implications. And they're going, if this all comes to fruition where they're all totally disclosed, they're going to be in big trouble, and they know it. And so they're fighting it tooth and nail. And there was another bill that came from Congress. Basically, they wanted it to have more oversight on the defense contractors, and basically give them 9 months to disclose what they had in terms of this wreckage and all that. And it had subpoena power built in it. And the bill almost got passed, but there was a few members of Congress that voted against it, and they're all the ones that get their money from Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and General Dynamics and the big defense contractors. But they got this close to getting it passed again, and then it just keeps coming and coming. And then one more thing that I'd just say briefly is there was a movie came out back in November. And anybody that's really interested in this would probably want to watch it. It's called The Age of Disclosure. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's pretty, after you watch it, there's not a lot to talk about, because you've got about 35 high-ranking government officials like admirals, generals, the current Secretary of State, and people that had high ranking in like the defense intelligence world. And they're all saying the same thing. Look, we're not alone. This is real. These UAPs have been interacting with us for a long time, and a lot of this stuff that's happening is absolutely real. And we don't know where they come from, but we clearly know they're here, and we're trying to figure it out. And if you watch, you watch that movie, that's like there's really not a whole lot to argue about at that point. I think that the government. Taking it into a step further, I think the government, the pretext behind all this information that's coming out is they're trying to portray this as a threat to national security. And I probably shouldn't say this, but if you want to ask yourself who the threat really is, we interviewed a guy that was highly involved in like these real high security projects last year. And he claimed, I probably shouldn't be, I can just see I'm the couple of black SUVs are going to pull up out here in front of my house. But we interviewed him, and he basically said that people high ranking individuals in our government that are typically not elected officials are directly involved with two different species of extraterrestrials, and he said that their prime objective was to eradicate nuclear weapons on this planet. And I think that's probably true, based on the fact that so many of these sightings and these occurrences happen around nuclear weapons facilities, storage facilities, missile silo bases, Air Force bases with aircraft with nuclear weapons on them. They seem to be very interested in what we're doing with nuclear weapons. And in the same token, they've been around for a long time. There's paintings in pyramids and ancient caves and pictures of flying saucers and flying machines and all that kind of stuff. But what I would say, the emergence of it really started when we started blowing up, testing nuclear weapons, and then we blew up, 2 cities in Japan with nuclear weapons. That's when you start to see a huge influx of UFO reports and that kind of thing, if that answers the question.
Do you think they ever reverse engineered a ship where they're now flying around our solar system?
You mean the defense contractors?
Sure, yeah.
I say this tongue in cheek, but I always said that NASA was the money laundering operation for the real space program. I'm probably going to get spanked for that, but I think there might be some truth in it. Clearly, there's things that have been developed that they're not telling the public about. And I think that back when they started the Space Force, a division of the U.S. military, and what I'm told is that the head of the Space Force sits at the lead chair in the cabinet where the Joint Chiefs operate. And there's a lot of I think there's a lot going on in space right now. Even technology-wise, a lot of these companies that are interested in aerospace and satellite projection, all that kind of thing, they're paying a lot of attention to this stuff.
Do you think that weapon they used in Venezuela, that sound-based weapon, is something from the ETs?
You mean reverse technology?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Partly because I don't know what exactly they used on them, but there clearly are. The old story is, the ETs had contacted us during the Eisenhower administration, and they were thinking they were going to give us technology to make this world better and all that. And what we did was we made weapons with it, and there's probably some truth to that too. It's kind of scary, but when you look at the threat of it, from the perspective of, when he was saying that they are concerned about nuclear weapons, and this guy, that might just been him talking, but he said, I think if somebody tries to use a nuclear weapon, they'll take them all. And when I think about that, every time I talk to somebody, everybody goes, I think that's okay, as long as they take them from everybody. And so, when you look at this and they're trying to portray this as a threat to national security, my question is who are they really a threat to? If it's you and me, and they're going to make sure that nobody ever uses a nuclear weapon on us, that's not really a threat as far as I'm concerned. Now, if you're a defense contractor and they're going to come and take your nuclear weapons, that's a big threat to you. You see what I'm saying? And so, in my books, I wrote about what they call a false flag. And essentially, what that means is there's a lot of people, and it's becoming. I wrote about that 4 or 5 years ago. It's becoming more and more and more accepted that it wouldn't be a surprise if these defense groups would try to put together some kind of a dog and pony show that would make us think we're being invaded by aliens. And if they could do that, that would get them allocated trillions more dollars to develop weapon systems to save us from that kind of scenario. And maybe that's a little conspiracy theorist, but I wouldn't be surprised if that there were some people thinking they might get away with that, for what it's worth.
Are you aware of which 2 species have been in contact here?
No. In the book, a lot of people ask me where they come from and what they look like. And there's some definitive answers there. First of all, we've come up with this, one of the reasons I wrote the book, and then I just revised it because there's so much that's come out in the last 3 or 4 years. One of the things is the concept of NHI. It's called non-human intelligence. And the reason that we use that now is because we used to say ETs, extraterrestrial, or EBEs, extraterrestrial biological entities. And when you say that, extraterrestrial connotates that they come from outer space and other planets, which is true. Some of them do come from outer space and other planets, but some of them come from other dimensions, and some of them come from other time constraints in the future, coming back. And some of them are interterrestrial, living in these places under the water and underground and things like that. So when you say non-human intelligence, it's just a better way a more accurate way to describe them. And then the concept of what they look like, that in what we know, again, I'm somebody that's looked at thousands of case reports and interviewed hundreds of people that have had encounters and made different types of sighting reports. And so the typical one that's most common that you see is that they call them grays. They're about 4 feet tall. They've got big heads, big black eyes, and they're typically involved in a lot of abduction scenarios. Those are grays. There's some that are more Nordic looking, that they look just like us. They're more, blonde haired, blue eyed, Scandinavian looking, and always in really good shape, male and female. And they are, I mean, you could sit next to them in a coffee shop somewhere and you wouldn't know it. They might know you because they could probably hear what you're thinking, but unless they wanted you to know that they were there, you wouldn't know it. And then there's some that are more reptilian looking. All of them are humanoid, where they walk on they stand up, they have 2 legs, 2 arms, 2 eyes, 2 ears. The reptilians, they're just more the facial expressions in their skin is more reptilian looking, and there's some of them that are they've got a head like a praying mantis, and they're real scary. But those are typically the ones that are described. But the Nordic ones, the tall whites, the women look just like us, except their skin's paler. They could go in a department store and buy makeup if they wanted to.
Well, what specific safety risks do first responders face during UAP encounters?
Well, yeah, thank you for asking. And that was the purpose of writing this book. That's two-pronged a little bit, because first of all, what I just described to you, the history lesson, if you will, to understand this phenomenon is real. It's been going on a long time, and a little bit about how they look and they operate would help an officer to at least have some level of understanding. In other words, if here's the typical scenario: a lady calls up the dispatcher. It's 2:00 in the morning, and something just landed or crashed in her pasture, and she's afraid it's going to hurt her horses. So she's frantic on the phone with the police. And so, you're the guy out there at 2 a.m, and you turn your blue lights on, you head that way. And next thing you know, you pull up in the pasture, and there it is. And if you have no idea, like if you have no training or no experience or understanding of any of this, it's going to scare the hell out of you. And at least if you read the books, you'll understand that this is real, it happens, and you're not losing it. And then the other side of that is what to do and not do. Okay. The first thing that I always tell them is that if you're in a police car, that is one of the safest places you can be. And you say, why do you say that, Richard? Because we have so many cases that we looked at over the years where, for example, a case where there's 3 people in an automobile and they're down in Texas, and for whatever reason they're stopped on the road, and there's this craft hovering right over the road. The 2 women get out of the car. And the third person's a young man, and he's scared to death, and he's curled up on the floor in the back seat. And these women are out there walking around a while, and then a few weeks later, the next thing you know, they're getting all kinds of tumors and blood clots and cancerous stuff that's horrible. And the guy in the back seat has no ill health effects at all. So what we determine is the metal in the car can protect you from the magnetic radiation that comes from those craft. The propulsion system is called electrogravitic, and it works kind of like an electromagnetic field, and it dispels gravity. But if you walk under it, it's like sticking your arm in a microwave oven. That's how the skin tissue damage deals with. So you want an officer to understand that. Don't get underneath it. If you can stay in your car. The most common type of an injury in a UAP encounter is eye injuries. And again, the windshield, tinted windows, and all that help protect your eyes a little bit. The other thing is, if you have something that's, if you have a craft that's landed and it's still powered up, there's certain things that you want to be careful about. A lot of people describe like a sheen around the metal. And what that is it's ultraviolet radiation that if you get close to it, it'll give you a sunburn like laying out in the sun all day. There's also, in some cases, there's nuclear radiation in the gamma and the X-ray spectrum that radiates out that would clearly cause you to have radiation sickness. Some of the other things that we talk about is not to point any type of spotlights or lasers at a hovering craft. And the reason I say that's because we've got plenty of case reports where people did that and it didn't end well for them.
I want to jump back to something you said, and that was that people have eye injuries. In what
Yes.
way?
Eye injuries that occur. It's like if you've ever seen anybody that's in a body shop or something that looked at an arc welding, that real bright white light that makes your eyes sore, burns your eyes. And there's a lot of times where people that have encounters, they'll go and the doctor will notice that they've got like real soreness around their eyes. That's like would be like from welding burns or something like that.
It's interesting that you mentioned shining lasers at UFOs because I had a guest that has claimed to do that, and he said the next night they came and paralyzed him in his house and ransacked his house.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard any other accounts of
Yes,
that?
there's tons of cases where people, in my book right now that I'm working on, I've got a case that I've actually investigated, and the gentleman was he was at home, and he heard the dogs fussing out, his dog getting all upset out in the backyard. He goes out in the backyard, he looks around, doesn't see anything, and the dog is looking up, and he looks up, and there's this huge triangle craft hovering right over his yard, maybe 100 feet above him. And so, he goes back in the house and he gets the camera, tries to take a picture of it, and the camera wouldn't work, which is very common. A lot of times people grab a camera, a video camera, and they'll point it up at the object, and then it'll be like the batteries are dead. And then the next day, we don't know, but it happens a lot. There's something about the technology they have or the propulsion they have that seems to mess up camera equipment. Very common. And then maybe the next day you'll go and the camera works fine, but it'll be like the batteries are dead. But very often cameras malfunction at close proximity. So what he did is he went in the house and he has one of those million candle power spotlights they use like for hunting, spotting deers and stuff like that. And he points it up on the craft, trying to get a better look at it. And when he does, the surface of the craft absorbs the light in a weird way. Then the next thing you know, this real bright, hot, white beam of light comes down on him. And it's really scorching hot. He drops down to his hands and knees and goes crawling in the house. And the next, when I went to meet with him and examined him, he had a T-shirt on, and he just looked like he'd been somebody that went and fell asleep out under the sun all day. And he just had this like blistering sunburn all over the back of his head and his arms and stuff like that. And, so there's dozens of cases like that where people will point a light or a spotlight or a laser at something, and then it never ends well after that. So, and there are various things that happen, but my point that I'm saying as a police officer, don't point a spotlight at it or a laser or anything like that, or even like a laser, speed detection thing. Because it could possibly cause them to do something that would be unpleasant.
What kind of psychological impacts does it have to the officers?
Well, one of the things that, again, the more informed you are, like for me, if I were to go out and have an encounter, I'm not going to get too excited about it because I've been doing this for 30 years and I understand it really well. But if you're a person that's never had any experience with this, don't know one thing about it, it's going to scare the hell out of you. And that's part of the reason why we write the books, is so people understand the phenomenon and also what not to do. One of the things that we've said is that if you do have, if you come across a situation where you've got something crashed on the ground and you're close to it, if you decide to approach it, there's some things to consider. First of all, if a police officer is going to have a gun in their duty belt, and I don't think that gun in the duty belt is going to be that big of a problem for you, but don't pull it out and start waving it around. And don't, these are sentient beings, but they have they can telepathically communicate with you. And so what we recommend is if you do encounter something like that, where something's crashed particularly, you want to get out of there thinking compassionately towards them. Think, I'm sorry this happened to you. Can we help you? We know this, we feel we want to help you, like that, because they can hear what you're thinking, or they can understand what you're thinking. And by the same token, if you got your gun out and you're like, I'm going to shoot the first thing that's moving, that's probably not going to end well for you. Because again, these guys are about 1,000 years ahead of us technologically. So the mindset's important. And then the other thing that I've written about too is that if something like this happens, they have what we call recovery teams or reconnaissance units that they're going to come and clean this wreck up. And if you typically what would happen, something would crash or land. They know about it because of all the technology that they have, and they're going to send these recon units out to take care of it. So they're going to quarantine an area, and then they're going to use local police to like maintain the perimeter, and if necessary, evacuate people. But the cops may not really be involved in what's going on inside that perimeter. You see what I'm saying? And so clearly, I want to make sure that police understand that when the government guys get there, they're going to take over, and they're not going to necessarily tell you what's going on. And you don't want to mess with them either, because they have power to, like, under the Patriot Act, they can arrest you and incarcerate you and, that kind of thing.
Are these guys that come out kind of like the Men in Black?
Mm-mm. No, these are government. Men in Black's different. I can explain that too. These guys that on these recon teams, there's a group called it's called NEST, and they're through the Department of Energy. Most of this stuff, we always thought of the Department of Defense being, the key controller or player in all this, and now we realize the Department of Energy is the one that classifies a lot of this, and they have these teams. They're recon teams. These guys are highly trained, like guys like Navy SEALs and special operations guys. They're armed to the teeth, and they've got equipment. They've got their own helicopters. They've got Learjets, and they can go anywhere in the world real fast. And they're going to come in, and it's going to be a pretty high grade military operation when they get there. They're going to we'll kick and take. I mean, you're not going to mess with them. And in my book, I happened to get a chance, and I took pictures. There was a recon unit that was coming back from somewhere, and they pulled in a gas station. It was in public view, and there was about 18 vehicles. I took pictures of them, put them in my book, but that sort of gives you an idea. The equipment's all like real high tech, like trucks with, all of them have blue and red lights like police do, but they're dark blue vehicles, and they've got all kinds of exotic equipment on the roof of them. And, they've got a command center, and all the people are wearing military uniforms and that kind of thing, but they move fast.
So these guys work for the government, not for
Yes.
these
Yes.
aerospace companies.
Correct. But they have deals with the air. See, the problem is this is all defined in what they call the legacy program. And this is something that's only come out in the last maybe year and a half or so. George Knapp started it. And basically what you're dealing with is the way it works is the CIA has the control of it. They've got written agreements with half the countries on this planet to take over if something like that happens. And they also have the technology, like through NORAD, where if something comes down, they're going to know about it real fast. And they can even see through the stealthing technology these guys use. So if something lands or crashes, they know. And they're kind of like the gatekeeper, the ones that run the show. And then what they'll typically do is the Air Force, in some of these military operations, are engaged to go perform these reconnaissance units. And they work closely with the guys the teams are called NEST that work through the Department of Energy. And they're the guys with the Learjets and the guns and helicopters, and that'll move on it really quickly. And then the other component is through the Department of Energy, from back in like 1946 when the original agreements were made, they have the legal capacity to classify anything that has to do with any type of nuclear energy. So a lot of this all of these UFO, UAP recoveries are immediately classified because of the potential for the nuclear energy and radiation that may be involved in their propulsion. You see what I'm saying? So a lot of this stuff that happens is almost immediately classified, which is why we don't get very many pictures of them or anything. You see what I'm saying?
Do you think these ships are just crashing, or do you think it's possible that somebody's bringing them down?
Both.
Both.
Originally, I think during the Truman era, if you look back during that World War II period, you had this really powerful anti-aircraft radar that was used to keep the Pearl Harbor thing from happening again, if you will. In the saucer craft that were there then, if they fly into that radar, it disables them and causes them to crash. So clearly, some of those crashes were caused by anti-aircraft radar, and they were obviously recovered. Now, and I mean, it breaks my heart to even think this, but I think that probably they do have some of these have been shot down. There's if you look at you know what a CE5 event is, where these people go out and they'll go out to a some remote place, and they'll have people meditate, and the craft will actually come in. Okay. They call those psionic. They're people that can do that. I know some of them. I've met people that, they can just go out in the backyard and start thinking about next thing something's here. I've seen it done. And those people are called psionic assets. And some of these government agencies have taken advantage of those people, where they'll go out somewhere and have somebody try to call one in, and then they'll try to shoot it down. And I'm pretty sure there's some of that going on. It's regrettable and scary and sad, but I think there's some of that happening.
Aren't they concerned that some of these NHIs may seek revenge?
That's why I say they're benevolent, because we've done a lot of mean things to them, and they've never really retaliated that much. I think they're benevolent, and I think that for the most part, and there's all different. All this stuff that was going on with the drones back in New Jersey and New York last year, that whole thing was like, in some of us, let me see how to say this. They used this concept of a drone to kind of cover this up. And some of the researchers like me think that, the word drone is the new word for swamp gas. Because back in the in the day, the blue book guys would get you and say, "Oh no, that wasn't a flying saucer. That was just swamp gas," and then they smile later. But the whole thing with the drones was, you got to understand something, that back around Christmas time, these things were swarming New Jersey. They were swarming New York. They were over. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio was shut down for a whole day, and almost a whole day, because there was a bunch of these drones that were swarming all over the place. And they officially said that it was shut down because the drones were swarming the place. That's pretty embarrassing for the head of the headquarters of the Air Force, having to shut the Air Force Base down because of drones. And then, well, we don't really know what they are. And the same thing was happening in Russia and China and in Germany, all over the world. That wasn't just here. So there was something going on back then. And it wouldn't surprise me if it started happening again.
How should a paramedic respond to a person who has been injured by radiation or some other thing?
Well, first of all, I think that one of the things we're trying to do in the training is the book is for first responders, police, fire, EMS, and all that. One of the first steps is to get these people to believe this stuff really happens. So Jeff, if you had an occurrence and the police came and you start telling them what happened, the next thing you're over in the psych ward. This guy's lost it. And so to at least have them understand that this stuff happens, and then what happens is a big plus as far as is helping them and trying to take care of them. But if you get exposed to radiation, that can cause a lot of problems, health, physiological problems. So I think having them understand that this happens and what happens makes a whole difference in how they're going to treat people, instead of just locking you up in a psych ward somewhere.
If a police officer comes up to a crashed ship and there's pieces of wreckage everywhere, should they not touch anything?
Well, yeah, that's what we say is that, and there's a couple of things that, in the book, there's a couple of pieces of equipment that we've recommended. There's a device that's a radiation detector, nuclear radiation detector. And back in the day, in the fallout shelter days, radiation detectors were like the size of a big yellow shoebox. They're big. These new ones now, I should have grabbed one out. It's in my pack, but they're like the size of a pack of cigarettes, and they've got a digital readout on the side of them, and they're 100 times more accurate, and they've got alarm systems. So what we recommend is using something like that, and then in my book, it's got the criteria where you set it, like what level's safe, and then what level's going to cause health issues and radiation, blah blah blah. And so there's another meter that works the same way for electromagnetic fields, and they're both small meters that can have alarms set on them. And so if you're in the situation where in close to that, if you have them, you just put them in your pocket, and if you start getting close to something that's radioactive, it's going to start beeping, and then to get back in your car, get back away from it. The distance, the proximity to it, as the further away from it you get, the less effect it has. And so there are a couple of instruments that you can use to detect radiation and also electromagnetic fields. And we recommend that is to, one of the worst things you can do is walk under something that's hovering. And then getting up close to something, you don't want to touch it. And if there is, if their body's there, you want to treat them the same way that you would if you were, dealing with somebody that had an infectious disease. You want to make sure you have the gloves and the suits and all that on, and the same way with a corpse. You'd want to use the hazmat gear if you have to deal with corpses, because there's been cases where like they've had crashes, and like military guys actually felt bad for the occupants, and they try to help them. And, they take them to the hospital, and like, well, we don't know what the hell to do with them, and eventually find somewhere that they can take care of them. But sometimes those guys got really sick. It would be like exposed to smallpox or something if you never were immune, that kind of thing. So gloves, hazmat suits, masks, all that are something you definitely want to use if you're dealing with occupants.
Do you recommend for these departments to have training exercises?
Absolutely, yeah. That's what we're trying to do now. Is I'm working with a number of people that are involved in that world, and what we want. My book was the first step, and I'm sure there'll be other books like that. Few people are going to plagiarize mine, which I've already seen a little bit of that, but that's okay. We're trying to help people, and the training is critical. And I think what you're going to see is, over the years, if you look at all the things that police were trained, now they get trained in terrorism and all that kind of stuff. And this is just another chapter in it. They just really have training to basically make sure that they understand that this is, to me, the biggest step is to train people to make them understand this really happens. And it's real. And then when you realize that, here's the different things that you're going to encounter. And then here's what you can do to protect yourself from any hazard, or a civilian. If there's a crash, you want to keep people away from it. You don't want curiosity seekers running up and touching it or getting close to it. And if you read books like my book, then you'll know what to do and what not to do. And that's that's the first step. I think it's just having knowledge, knowing what to do and not do is really very important. And again, understanding it's real and it happens is important, because it takes some of the stigma out of it. If like I said, if you encounter something like this, you didn't have one clue about any of it, it'd scare the hell out of you.
Let's say somebody who's listening to this podcast happens to witness a crash on their property somewhere. Should they call the police first or the government?
Well, that's interesting. That's a good question. In the past, there's been organizations, probably MUFON was one of them, the National UFO Reporting Center, NICAP, back in the day. They were all civilian operations. And you know, if you went and Googled what do you do if you see a UFO, it would tell you to contact one of those groups. It seems like now there's a lot more emphasis on people calling the police. And the reason I say that is up in New York, I was watching this interview with one of the sheriffs I think it was in Sussex County. And there was, the airports there were getting swarmed with these drones, and they actually had to close the airport down over the holiday season for a while. And so the commissioners and all these people, they've got the sheriff cornered, and they're like, what are you doing about this? What are you going to do about it? And I would think they would have had the FAA and the Air Force Base and all that there, but they didn't. They were on the sheriff about it. And so from a public standpoint, they're starting to look at police like, what do we do? You know, and the sheriff's offices. And that's something that probably is only happening in the last couple of years, you know. To an extreme extent. They've always called the police if something weird's happening, but there's a lot more emphasis on that now. And, you know, the jury's out on which organization to call and all that kind of stuff. I think that they'd like to have, you know, people say to me, well, we need to have a national government operation that takes care of all this. And I'm like, well, we've already had all that for like 80 years and they never told the public anything, you know? And so I'm not really an advocate of trusting the government to do that kind of thing. So, you know, for how much trouble that'll get me in.
What are some of the most compelling cases that you have investigated that these first responders should take a look at?
Well, all this time, I've had 4 books out, as you know. And when I go to book signings and I speak, one of the things that people ask me is like, well, what about cases? Can you tell us about cases? And based on that, I'm writing a book right now that's basically short stories about cases I've worked on. And each chapter is a short story about a type of phenomenon or an event that occurred, and it's told from the person's perspective. And I try to make it so that it conveys all the unusual paranormal or the high strangeness that's encountered that people feel and experience when they do that. So that's what we're working on now. One of the cases that we just talked about was the case with the gentleman that had the triangle out over his house, and that was a very, very good case. I sent people to work on that, but I went with them and I actually interviewed the guy. And unfortunately, he did develop some health risks from what happened to him. There was a case that we worked on up in New York, where a gentleman was, he's a nurse practitioner. He's driving home from work at midnight. And it's Christmas time. He's listening to Christmas music on the radio, driving a new car. And he comes over the hill and he sees a light. And he goes down the valley. He comes back up. Now the light's closer and brighter. And it's kind of rolling hills. And pretty soon he's getting in the lights. It's like right on him, up close. So he pulls off the road. And the thing comes in and kind of hovers over his car. And I'm talking close proximity, maybe 100 feet or treetop level. And he's in the car, and all of a sudden, everything's dead. The headlights go out, dash lights go out, the radio goes off, cell phone's dead, and he's sitting there in the car in the dark. And he says he can hear what sounds like a cat purring, a humming noise, which is very common in those kind of encounters. And so, you know, he goes and he's at first he was curious, and then he starts getting really scared, and he's like, should I run, stay in the car? I don't know what to do. And the answer is stay in the car. So he opened the door. He finally got the door open because the electric lock, nothing would work. But he finally got his door open. He still got his seatbelt on. He's looking out like this to see what it is. And when he did that, it stopped. The lights were out. It's gone. And all of a sudden, everything in the car is running again. And I said, did it fly away, or did it just turn off its lights? He goes, I don't know. But when my car started, I just stepped on the gas, got the hell out of there. And so when we interviewed him, I sent somebody up to interview him. And when the investigators got there the next day, he said that there was a static cling on that car, like if you take a sweater out of a cleaning bag, you can feel that static electricity from about a foot away when you put your hand out. And so we did some tests on it, and there were like real strong magnetic fields on the car. It was like magnetized. It's kind of like in science class, you take a magnet and you put it on a nail, and then after a while, the nail gets magnetized. The same effect apparently occurs with an automobile because the car had a really strong, it was magnetized. It had a really strong magnetic field. And they interviewed him like 2 days after. I went back about 2 weeks later to interview him again, and the fields had started to dissipate a little bit, but they were clearly very strong. But the thing that I wanted to talk to the guy about, he said when the craft left, he said everything came back on. And he goes, yeah, and the dash lights were on, the headlights were on, the music was playing, my phone was on again, the car's running. I said, oh, so the car started up again? He goes, no. I said, what do you mean, no? He goes, it didn't start. I said, you go, and it starts up. He goes, no, that's not what happened. I'm like, what happened? He goes, it was like if you're watching a movie and you push the pause button and then you push the play button again and everything's running. The car did not start. It was just running again. And I got calls from about 5 or 6 people around the world that worked on, there's only a half a dozen cases like that where we have documented that happens. But that is very significant because the car didn't start. It was just running again, which would indicate there's some kind of a time displacement, an anomaly with time, that they probably somehow stopped the time around the car.
That's amazing.
It is. And that's, that kind of thing with time happens in different types of time. It's called time dilation. And when you talk about like some of these government whistleblowers, that like one of these guys that David Gresh actually had gone to meet with some Wall Street people a couple of months ago. And he goes into this meeting and he's got a picture of a craft that's about 40, it's a saucer type craft. It's about 40 feet diameter. And he tells them, he goes, we have this craft. It's in a facility. And he goes, the doors are open, we can get in it. And he said, when you walk inside it, it's about 40 feet across. But when you walk inside it, it's like stepping inside a football stadium. And that takes a minute to get your head wrapped around that. And there's also a time dilation effect that occurs. So, for example, if you were to step into something like that, and I've heard people talk about that, and it makes you nauseous because it totally disorients you for a minute. But let's say you're in there for 10 minutes. When you come out, 5 hours may have passed outside. It's called time dilation.
Earlier, you were talking about CE5 events, and at these events, in my opinion, most people see these things that are like plasma orbs.
Sometimes. Orbs, plasma, well, yeah. What
are those?
I don't think we really know for sure what they are. We just know that they show up. I mean, I have, I'm not going to say any names, but I know people that can go out on the back porch and do that. And some of the pictures they show me are like pretty incredible. And, like I'm talking to this woman and she's trying to communicate with this thing and it's kind of like blue. And she goes, can you change color for me? And it turns red, like you can hear what she's thinking, It's like, wow, that's pretty crazy. Because I don't think there's any way for somebody to fake that, you know what I mean? Not easily. Right.
And it makes me wonder, is that a living being or is that a ship?
Clearly there's some conscious energy in it. Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, whether it's a probe and being, a lot of times it could be a probe. Like you'll see a large craft and then these orbs come down from it. And they, I've got cases where they zoom around in somebody's house or garage. It's just like they're checking it out, So it could be a probe that's controlled by some conscious energy or it could have some consciousness to it.
Did you take a look into the Bugosphere?
What do you mean?
I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Bugosphere, that metal ball that was floating around.
I don't know very much about it. I think, isn't Greer the one that's working on that?
I think so.
Yeah. I think he will probably publish. I like him. I've met him before, and a lot of what he says I think is right on. But I think they're doing some research on it now, like what it is, and I'm not up to speed on it though. But it wouldn't be surprised. I mean, there's a lot of things that are found in artifacts that are like, what we think of, something is 10,000 years old and there's like a perfectly formed gold chain in it or something like that. That's like that technology wasn't available then.
How do you address skepticism with the first responders?
That's a good question. And, I've been doing this, like I said, for 30 years. And I was in the secular, I worked in the financial world, which gave me the money to go do the exploring and the time off and all that. But I'll tell you, 15 years ago, I was doing I was down in Charlotte and I belonged to the Rotary there. And, everybody knew because I'd done some Discovery Channel shows and stuff like that. And everybody knew I was involved with this. And they're like, oh, will you do a presentation about UFOs? And I'm like, yeah. And so what I did, I put something together that was real generic. There was nothing creepy in it. Just like, this is how many reports come in every month. And this is, so many, they're triangles, some are this. It's just all pretty generic stuff, not to shake anybody up too bad. And so I'm doing my presentation, and this guy, it was a big Rotary meeting in Charlotte, and this guy, there's a couple hundred guys in there having lunch, and ladies, and this guy gets up and he starts talking about how somebody took these two monkeys and spray painted them with green paint and turned them loose somewhere. And of course, everybody started laughing. He just wanted to disrupt my presentation. He's being a smart. And so I finish, and getting ready to leave, and one of the guys who I know comes up to me, and I knew that he was a retired colonel from the Air Force, and I knew that he was a fighter jet pilot, and he's retired. And he goes, hey, Rich, would you, I need you to meet with my son and I for coffee sometime next week. Can you do that? And I'm like, yeah. So I go meet him in a coffee shop, and it turns out his son is an Eastern Airlines captain. And he goes, I just want him to tell you what happened to him last month. And so this guy starts telling me about how they're out in flight in this huge craft, like 3 times as big as their airplane, comes right up on them. And, it stays with them for 20 minutes. They're trying to maneuver around it and tell me what it looked like and all that kind of stuff. And that was kind of how it was back then. You'd get up and you'd start talking and you have some smart trying to make a fool out of you. And then after you're done, somebody come up to you and go, hey, when I was in the military, you won't believe what happened to me. And that's the way it was 15 years ago. Well, they're not doing that anymore because all the stuff that's coming out now, there's so many things going on in Congress, and there's so many things that are available to people in the podcast like what you're doing. People are understanding this is real. We don't understand completely what's going on. We don't know all, but we know it's real, and we want to know more about it. So people aren't they're a lot more accepting and interested, obviously, than they were 15 years ago.
Do you think Trump will be the disclosure president and everything's going to come out soon?
Well, it's pretty hard to predict what Trump's doing. There's nothing that would make me happier if he did that. So we'll see. But yeah, I hope he does. And just from a side, if he does, he will go down in history as pretty remarkable, despite from everything else that's going on. That'll be like a huge, part of his legacy if he does that. It sounds like he's going to. He's trying to. But again, you got to realize, you're pushing against a lot of really powerful entities there. These defense contractors, they're going to fight it tooth and nail. The deep state, they know their days are coming to an end, but they're gonna be hanging on, like scratching the whole time out. You know what I mean? They're not going to give it up easy. So you've got a lot of dark forces that are pushing against that. So if he does, it takes a lot of courage.
I would assume that China and Russia have some recovered crashes
Absolutely.
themselves, and maybe
Yep.
other countries. How come no one else is, hasn't disclosed anything yet?
Well, that's one. Clearly the Russians do, and the Chinese do, and in the history lesson that I write, is a big part of that came back from during World War II. The Germans were doing the same research we were, and they were actually more on it than we were. And then after the war was over, we repatriated all those German scientists. It was called Operation Paperclip, and basically they brought them to the United States, and they got houses, and they brought their kids, and they got incomes, and they worked for research companies. Like the beginning of NASA was a lot of Nazi scientists, and so that happened. Now you've got the Russians and the Chinese, and I think there may be some elements like with our guys and some of the guys from Russia that are kind of cooperating behind the scenes together. It seems, sometimes people say when these drones and different things, these UAPs, oh, that's just the Chinese, and that's such a line of, because it's just not so. When all that stuff was going on with the drones, there was many airports in Russia and China got shut down as there were here, in Germany and other places in Europe. So, yeah, I do think that from what we learned, there was an article that came out in the Daily Mail, which is a European newspaper last year, that talked about the CIA and how they basically have control of it. And I think that they have agreements with about half the countries in the world to, to step in when something like this happens and take care of it and that kind of thing. But they do. And there's been conflicts. There was, again, one of the things that, that like Greer and a lot of them are saying is a lot of the craft that we see in the reports now are actually alien reproduction vehicles. They're vehicles that have been back engineered by these aerospace contractors. And most common is one that's like a triangle-shaped craft that shows up in the data in the case reports. And most of us know that that's a man-made craft just based on the information. Lockheed Martin's been making them for 10 or 15 years. And, there's a case that I heard a little bit about. I interviewed a guy that out in Nevada somewhere, one of those things crashed. And the Lockheed Martin sent their guys out to clean the crash up. And at the same time, the government reconnaissance units showed up. And apparently there was a shootout. A couple people got killed. And because Lockheed, the company, doesn't want the other organizations getting access to their technology. Everything is stovepiped, or they call it stovepiping, where what one group doesn't want the other one to know what they're doing, and they're all competing with each other. So there's all that element too.
Well, if people want to find out more about your book, where should they go?
Let me give you my website. Hang on a second. There we go. We started an organization called Aerospace Research. It's a new group that is designed for training and consultation and some investigation. The website is aeroops.site. You can see it above my head there. And if you go on that site, you'll find links to get the books. And there's also some podcasts in there that talk about different types of equipment, how to use it, and that kind of thing. And then we also did a series on abduction. I interviewed a number of people that are pretty notorious in the abduction world, and we talked about different elements of that and how that's evolved as well. But you'll find a link to my books and a lot of interesting. There's some podcasts on there, a lot to do with like the different types of cameras that are used, different types of radiation detectors, and that kind of thing.
Do you have a contact form on your website in case someone wants to ask you questions?
Yeah, my the contact information, there's an email address on there, and also I think my phone number's on there too. If you go to that website, anything you need is about me. My background's on there. Some of our advisory board's on there, and there's there's a contact information.
All right.
Yeah, we have local post office box. There's an email address and also a phone number.
Richard, before we finish up, can you leave us with a last positive message?
In the books, I had what I called the epilogue. It's very short. It said, the biggest event in human history will be the discovery that we are not alone and that there are other intelligent living entities in the universe from whom we may learn something. The concept of full disclosure for the public, making available direct, intimate contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, would obviously revolutionize life on Earth, not only by introducing amazing transportation technology, free energy production, and unheard of medical innovations, but also producing advanced knowledge, enlightenment, and an elevation in human consciousness, which will surely break the bonds that the intellectual elite and the world bankers have over our human society. So when the ETs openly show themselves to the world, which may be very soon, perhaps we should embrace them and be nice. Does that work?
That works. Richard, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thanks. It was fun. I enjoyed it.
It was a great show. Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.